Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel, and today I'm going to show you a few of the basic joints you want to weld up, especially if you're wanting to make like a set of rock slide or something like that. So little things you're going to need is some square tubing, and we're going to use some scrap pieces. We're not going to weld up a full slider here. Some flat stock and tube, depending on how you want to build this type of stuff. And then we're going to use our MIG for everything. So all this material is 1/8 inch thick. You can go as thick as you want. And if you remember on one of our previous videos, I showed you how to work the calculations back for how much voltage and wire speed you're going to need. Let's get some of this prepped. We'll talk about the material, and I'll even show you how to cut out a bad weld if you need to. We're going to go through and take off all the burrs off the edges. We're going to put a nice chamfer on the edges, and then we're going to sand it back a little bit to get rid of some of the mill scale. Now some mill scales are thicker than others, like this cold roll material does not have as thick a mill scale as a hot roll material. But it's very key that before you weld, you work back all that mill scale. It takes a lot of energy to get through that, and it will weaken your welds. Now, especially on tube, if you don't have an angle grinder or something, you can always use a piece of Scotch-Brite or a piece of emery paper and just go around it. Okay, so we're going to just weld up a couple of quick joints for you. So if this was your mount for your frame, this would be the riser coming off, and this would just be where your slider would come across. So I want to talk about tubing seams real fast. Unless you're running DOM tube or drawn over mandrel, you're going to have some type of seam. So this is typically what like cages are made out of, but the majority of things you're going to build doesn't need to be DOM. It's going to have some kind of seam in it, like ERW or the standard square tube. There's going to be a seam where it's been folded back together and welded back up. And for me, especially being a hobby welder, where that seam is at is very important. Like if it's on the slider, I don't put the seam on the outside where I'm going to slide against. I'll tuck that to the inside, that way I don't have to worry about the seam splitting. Same thing here, if this is going to be the outside of the slider, I don't put the seam on the outside, I'll tuck the seam on the inside. So we're going to have a base piece, the riser, and a piece of cross. So we've got a couple of joints we're going to weld up. I'll refer back to that chart you see right here that allows you to go back and get your base settings for your MIG welder. Now most of our settings for these 1/8 inch materials are going to be 18 volts at 220 on the wire feed. So we're going to be running C25 at around 30 CFH. Now we are running right now 0.030 hard wire. Now I'm a firm believer, if you can't see it, you can't weld it. So if you haven't done this in a while, take a second and clean your gear. Remember, the lenses on the inside of the hood and the outside are both replaceable. And if you're like me, you're getting older, clean your readers you weld with as well. I'm going to weld these two pieces together first. Alright, so I don't get a lot of pulling. I'm going to come in and tack this corner, then I'm going to tack the other corner, then we'll run the beads on it. I'll run up one side and I'll run the other one the opposite direction. So a little bump on the trigger. Now is when, if you want to go back and double check and make sure everything is where you want it to be, that everything is square, now is the time to do that. We're going to come into the corner. I always try to come up the corner, over and around the corner. Try to wrap the corners when you weld. And then it's just going to be a small circle as I go across. So as I'm going around the weld, I'm saying to myself, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. I'm counting to myself. That way I can pace myself. So that when you get through, the weld looks fairly even. Once again, I'll be the first to say I'm just a hobby welder. So I started on the corner, same thing, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And make sure you have a good set of gloves, because this part is hot as hell right now. And, well, it's hot. So this side I welded this way. If I weld it the same direction, this weld will have gone this way and this weld will have gone that way, and they'll be pulling opposite of each other. As usual, I never start with that burnt up ball on the end of the wire. I always start on the end and I make a test. Can I get all the way across? Which I can. Now I'll typically weld with the respirator. I don't do it when I film because it's kind of hard to talk. And listen to that sound. So just a reminder, when it sounds right, that's what it sounds like. Alright, so I'm going to weld this stringer from this corner to that corner next. Now it's going to be a little more humped up because it really doesn't have very much of a place to go. And it's up to you later if you want to grind that weld off or not. Keep in mind, the more weld you grind off, the more strength you take out of it. And since I'm running hard wire, I'm going to be pushing the wire. Remember, vertical, back about 15 degrees, and then across. And then at the very end, I come back just a little bit to fill the crater in. And I'm using the same 1, 2, 3 method as you go across. Now, I don't like to grind welds off, but if you've got something that has to sit flat on the sides, let's say you're building a handrail, well, you're going to have to grind off the weld on the one side because no one wants their hands running across that. Right? So this could be a slider, could be a handrail. Right? Just think about the conditions where this joint would be useful. So the round tube is a little different. Obviously, you don't have corners to tack. So I'm going to tack them 90 degrees to each other, and then I'm going to weld from tack to tack. So if you're running round tubing, I would weld the base on very last, and that way you don't have to worry about welding this on and this tube's all of a sudden running off at an angle. Now round tubing is a little different to weld. And when you're tacking something like this, the order that your tacks go in are somewhat critical as well. Let me show you why. How you tack and weld is very critical. So right now we're running fairly square. I'm going to lay a real heavy tack on one side only. And I laid a pretty heavy tack on that one side. And I fully expect this thing to be out of square a little bit. You can see how it opened up on the top because it's pulling it over. So that's why I typically like to do a light tack. And how you would pull this back into position is I'm going to push it back over. So now we're pretty close to being back in square. So part of welding is also trying to manage all the movement. Now I'm trying to reach around the camera to lay that weld down, but what I'm trying to show you is this. If you look down here at the base, you can see how the base is pulled away. That's because the weld's pulling heavily on one side. And if you are welding something like this and you have it all tacked and you hear a ting or something like that, that's when your tack's breaking loose. Alright, welding round is different. I'm going to brush off the stuff from the tacks so it's not in my weld. And this is just a good stainless brush. And out of habit, you should always just go ahead and buy stainless brushes. That way if you need to use them on aluminum or stainless, it works very well. You don't have to worry about embedding the carbon into it. I'm going to start at one tack, and I'm just going to go around. And keep in mind, as you do this, you have to turn your wrist a little bit, because if I start here like this, it's not going to come around in the right spot. So as I go, I'm going to turn my wrist just a little bit and end on the other tack. Later, you can see if you can go from end to end. Walk around. Now we just connect the dots. Now if you notice, I welded these two sides. As I got back to this side, I went over here, then I finished this one. That way I wasn't just continually going around it. So then you have your weld that goes around the tube. Now just like we talked about before, this is seam tubing. So I'm going to put the seam towards the bottom. That way I have less chance of the seam splitting. This will take a lot of beating. We have a set of sliders we built on the channel that actually go on a Gen 4 Toyota. And I've watched them, we'll put the full weight of the vehicle on them numerous times. Alright, so just like before, I'm going to start here, and I'm going to weld around to this point. Now I use my hands to rest myself. Don't try to freehand this. So I've got my hand open, holding the gun, and that way I can close and open my hand as needed as I go across this thing. And that helps steady, the movement. Okay. Now I like TIG welded tubes, but it's not everybody has a TIG welder. So I got a weld. It sputtered a little bit when it first started, and I think it lost ground from the table. Okay. So just think about this as a rock slider, right? This is going on your vehicle here. Your rock sliders are all built here. Same exact thing. Right, let's weld this up, then I'll show you how to cut out a weld if you need to. Same thing, I'm going to tack the corners. Now I always like to brush the tacks afterwards. Now if you're running flux core, that's a must. And then we weld. So there's that side. I rolled the corner. So I'm going to come to the other side. Same thing. So then that'll be your weld joints. Just try to make them look as good as you can, but more importantly, try to be as functional. Damn, that's hot. Let's just say that you've got a bad weld joint here. I don't like this weld joint. How do I fix this? Right? So let me show you. All right, so if we want to take this weld out, I'm going to use our portable table. So you're going to have to do what you want to do in your area, but I don't like blowing sparks all the way across the shop. And well, there is a gas can there I need to move. So that's why I got these little pieces of corrugated. And I'll put those up that I'll grind into. So once you've ground it out, just re-prep it. Now, anybody who's ever told you they've never had to grind out one of their welds either accepts everything they do and don't pay attention to what they're doing, or they're lying to you. It's one of the two. So then just go back in and lay that weld back in there. So you can grind it back out and then put it back in. You're going to make some bad welds. It's just part of it. Alright, so what do you think? So I was just welding up simulated rock sliders. So if you want to build rock sliders, this can easily become a handrail. Right? So just because I'm calling a rock slider doesn't mean that it can't be a handrail. Right? You can see the shape. So we did the round onto the flat. We did a cope joint. Now I've got videos on the channel to show you how to cope the joints as well. You don't have to have a fancy coping machine. So you can very easily go back to one of the other videos where it shows coping, takes you to the website that asks you a few questions, and it prints out a template you wrap around. It's real easy, especially if you're fairly new to coping tubes. Then we did the squares. Right? So this can vary, once again, can be a rock slider, frame mount, where it comes out you're going to slide against, can be a handrail just as easy. It just depends on what your goal is. And remember, we talked about seams also, and it shows up better on a tube. Manage your seams, because the difference between DOM tubing and ERW or seam tubing, obviously DOM's a lot stronger, but it's probably 4 or 5 times the cost at minimum when you can get it right now. And then we went over how to repair a weld. Right, so we went over how to repair a weld. You're going to make some bad welds. It's okay. I've made bad welds. You're going to make bad welds. And the person that tells you they've never made a bad weld, they've never had to grind out, either don't have very high standards or they're lying to you. Right? So there's other things on the channel, how we built the rock sliders, how we cope the tubes. We've went over the welder, we went over the saw we use, and on the next video we'll go over some flux core stuff. So please remember to like, subscribe, and share, and I'll see you when these videos will pop up here. This is another edition of Jeepingmo.